So this video that you're getting ready to see is our interview of Dr. David Sinclair for the Wild Health Summit Day 1. Today is Day 3, the final day of the Wild Health Summit. If you would like to join in and ask questions of the guest, you can sign up at wildhealthsummit.com. We will be releasing all of the content for free on this podcast. So if you'd like to be notified as soon as the podcast come out with Dr. Weil, Ben Greenfield, and our other guests, subscribe to the podcast and you'll get immediate notification when we release. Again, if you want to ask questions today on Day 3 of the summit, Monday, April 6th, then go to wildhealthsummit.com to register. Thanks for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. For the foreseeable future, you're not going to hear our normal intro or outro here. We're going to be releasing episodes very frequently as things are changing. This channel will be used for a very specific purpose. Number one, to communicate with our patients. We're somewhat overwhelmed, and the more we can communicate breaking news and recommendations from us to our patients all at once, the better. So if you're a patient, we're here for you if you need us, but if possible, please tune in here so we can both keep you up to date and conserve our time for the most critical tasks. Feel free to share this with friends and colleagues as well. Number two, we've organized as a group. We have infectious disease specialists, ER doctors, critical care doctors, and in total dozens of MDs, PhDs, and frontline clinicians who are going to be constantly evaluating the news and emerging evidence. We're then going to summarize and translate that for you here every day on the podcast. The speed of change with the circumstances will make us look foolish at times, but we're committed to pouring all of our resources and energy into doing what we can to help and make a difference. You can also follow our updates at wildhealth.com or our Instagram account at wildhealthmd. And if you're a patient, we're here for you. Please tune in here for the updates and let us know how we can help. All right.
I think we're coming up on 11 a.m., huh?
I think to give Dr. Sinclair the most time possible, Jody, let's go ahead and bring him up as a panelist. And Mike, if you want to introduce Dr. Sinclair and start the questions, say we get it going.
Dr. Sinclair, thanks for being with us here today. We're excited to have you. David Sinclair, Ph.D., is a professor at the Department of Genetics and co-director of the Paul F. Glenn Center for Biology and Aging at Harvard Medical School. He's best known for his work on understanding why we age and how to slow its effects. We've actually had David on the podcast 2 or 3 times now, I believe, the Wild Health Podcast, and spoke with him a little bit about COVID-19. And before that, spoke with him more generally about aging in general, which is his probably how he's best known. David, I'm really happy to have you here with us. I know that you've got a background in epidemiology, and you've been so active on Twitter, and the information that you've been tweeting out during this pandemic has, I know, been very helpful for me and a lot of other physicians that are on the front lines trying to get information in real time. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
All right. Well, good. Well, good morning, everybody. And thanks, Mike and Matt. What you're doing is a real service. I think getting experts in their fields together is something that I haven't seen done publicly yet in this fashion. So, thank you again for this opportunity to talk and take questions.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here with us. I wanted to get us started with something sort of easy, just get the ball rolling. So what is the course of disease in people? What should we expect to be seeing happening from COVID-19 in patients and in the public?
Right. Well, it's quite varied. And you guys being, well, first of all, a disclaimer, I'm a PhD. I study biology. I've got a PhD in biochemistry genetics with a focus on microbiology. So that's where I come from. I work as a researcher, mostly with animals, some clinical trial stuff, and I'm also entrepreneurial with a company that's, a few companies, but one in particular that's relevant is making test kits for the detection of viruses. And so where I'm coming from is I'm certainly not here to give medical advice, but I'm also able to touch various elements of academia, the front lines with colleagues who are doctors, industry where they're suffering with, I'm running, probably helping run probably a dozen companies right now and what to do there, as well as, the test kits that I mentioned. So, I wouldn't say that, I'm the world's expert in one topic. I'm more like a generalist in many topics. But I think in today, what I can offer is more of an overview, a synthesis of all of these data points coming in. And then we'll hear from certainly a lot of experts today. So you asked me, Mike, about the presentations of the disease. So it turns out that there's a lot of different types of symptoms, and they're not all the same. It's not clear, but about half of people don't have severe symptoms. So this is the problem really for, I think, most people who are wondering why is this such a big deal. The problem with this virus, coronavirus, versus other diseases like the first SARS and MERS is that it's got a long incubation period, and you can be spreading this without symptoms. And it can take many, many days before you're actually showing symptoms. The typical range of symptoms that you'll get are, well, the first is a tickle in your throat and a cough. About 83 to 99% of people develop a fever. So that's a pretty good sign that this is probably a COVID-19 case. Most people, 59% to 82%, develop a dry cough. Typically, you don't get a runny nose. There was a really great Nature paper. For those of you who aren't scientists, what I highly recommend is most of the abstracts being written in scientific papers are readable. And if they're not, I try to translate the important ones. But you can go to sites like PubMed, one word, pubmed.org, and Google for these kinds of things, or, quote unquote, Google. There are other sites called bioRxiv, BIORXIV, and medRxiv, MEDRXIV. And every day there are new papers coming out, and that's what I'm reading every morning. So getting back to the symptoms, so there's the cough, there's fatigue in about half the people. Shortness of breath, this one, once it starts to descend into the lungs from your nose and throat, you'll start to feel breathless. This is an early sign as well. And I'm not a doctor, but I've heard colleagues of mine say that if you want to test if you've got shortness of breath, one good way is to try to hold your breath for about 15 seconds. And if you have trouble doing that, it might be an issue. But I think if you're struggling to walk to the kitchen, whereas before you had no trouble and you get breathless, that's a pretty good sign. There's about a third of patients have a lot of sputum production. And then headaches are another symptom. And I'm not sure the percentage, but in this Nature paper that I referred to earlier, they gave a number of clinical symptoms. And I was surprised that it was a small group. It was about a dozen patients that about a third of them had diarrhea. And that's caused because the virus can attach not just to the ACE2 enzymes on the surface of your nose and lungs, but also your gut. That's where ACE2 is most prevalent.
Yeah, we've talked to physicians around the world, and it's really interesting. You look at lists of symptoms, and we love to have a clinical decision rule to say you have the diagnosis or not, but it's really difficult. The symptoms, they're varied, and the more data we get, they seem to be changing. So it's really difficult clinical diagnosis.
Well, there was one study, and I know we're trying to stick to facts. So one study that looked at what's called RT-PCR, which some of you may not know is reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction. It's basically a long word for taking the RNA out of your system, that viral RNA, converting it to DNA, and then amplifying it in a little machine that you can have on your desk. So that study found that more than 13%, about 13% of confirmed cases in children were completely asymptomatic. And then another study, I believe this is in China, but the nursing facility residents about half are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic at the time of the test. So this is the big issue. It's that you go to spring break, young people are having parties, they think this is not a big deal, no one seems sick, and then they take it home.
And I think we're going to come back to that asymptomatic question and testing in a minute, but I want to ask you some big kind of overarching questions, because I feel like you've got your pulse on things in general, and your opinion is really valuable. So you won't have a lot of data to answer this question, but I'd love to hear your opinion. Your lab, we've been following you for years. The research you produce out of your lab is incredible when it comes to longevity, but your lab is shut down right now. When do you think we're all going to be allowed out? What does that look like? When will you be able to be in your lab working on research projects again? And when will the rest of us be able to go back to work?
Well, yeah, that's the $10 trillion question. And so I'm getting inputs from historians, guys like Neil Ferguson is a friend and sending me a lot of his thought. We have epidemiologists. The ones that I'm looking at are, most of them are out of Britain, actually. And that was where a lot of the first models came from, though I will say that their models have been a little bit more sanguine over the last couple of weeks. So look for the group out of the Imperial College in London. The other inputs that I'm taking in that are worth paying attention to are the current course of the disease. I'm looking at all the numbers and comparing that to previous outbreaks, including the 1918 pandemic. And then the other thing to really watch is what's happening in Asia, Southeast Asia and China. Is it coming back, or are they able to contain it once it goes down? So all of that put together, I don't have a magic crystal ball, but here's what I think. And I'm fine making predictions based on all of that. I think that the initial thoughts of us getting out, obviously in early April, that was always going to be wrong. I don't think we're going to be out anytime in May, let out in masses. I think it's more like a mid-June and possibly into July timeframe, depending on how quickly the numbers come down. Now, if they came down very quickly in China because they were under severe lockdown, but you can see there was a New York Times article a couple of days ago. You can look it up. It was on April 2nd, looking at the movement of people with GPS tracking on their phones, I believe it was, but we can also I've looked at GPS car tracking, and there's still a lot of the United States moving around. What that means to me is that, yeah, New England, where I'm in Cape Cod here with my family, we're really not moving based on that data, but there are a lot of parts, especially in the south, east of the country and Texas, where people are not taking it as seriously and governors are not taking it as seriously. So what's all that mean? I think that it's going to be slower than China to come back around. China was able to bring their numbers down within 4 weeks from the peak. I think it'll probably take 6 weeks for the US. I was not excited, but I was happy to see that Italy is coming down. So I think Italy is more similar than China to us. There are still a lot of rebellious people in the US, just like in Spain and Italy. And those rebellious people will drag this out a bit. But yeah, if I was to put a number on it, I'd say at least another 6 weeks. And I'm not sure if schools, meaning high schools and middle schools, will go back at all this year. Probably not universities either. And hopefully by September, I think things will be back to somewhat normal. But it'll depend on whether this comes back like in 1918. It came back as the temperatures and humidity changed.
David, you recently tweeted an article that went over a model showing a peak in 2021 if we continued to socially isolate through 2020 and into 2021. What's your take on that? Have you seen any other models that have suggested that?
Well, all the models are wrong or flawed at least. The first model that was published, there was a great article in many ways by Nicholas Christakis in the New York Times. It's about a week ago if you want to check it out. And their model, which was based on academic modeling, which was, it's decent. What they did was they looked over the next, I think it was 6 months, and they said, here's what happens to us if we don't isolate and if we do. And there was a massive difference. It was a difference of hundreds of thousands of infections. And so that sounded great, but then what I saw and I tweeted out was that if you take that model and extend it to the end of 2020 into 21, and we all go back to a normal, quote unquote, normal life, then we have the same number of infections anyway. The truth is somewhere in between, that we are not living a normal life now, and we will not live a normal life until probably mid-2021, when either we've had enough herd immunity or the vaccine is being widely distributed. So it's somewhere in between. We're going to probably bring this down in the next 6 weeks, and then case by case, state by state, maybe even profession by profession, and possibly even those who've recovered versus those who haven't ever had an infection of COVID-19 or coronavirus 19 will be selectively let out. I haven't heard any exact plan from the government as to what that rollout is going to be. Is it case by case, profession by profession, survivors versus not? But pre-symptomatic people. I don't know where this is going to actually roll out. But the important point is, if we don't remain with social isolation, or at least social modification and more screening, it will come back with a vengeance later in the year.
So stepping away a little bit from the impact on society and going a little bit back more to basic science, which you're clearly about 1,000 times more expert in than any of the other people sitting on this panel with you. What makes the virus, this particular SARS-CoV-2, what makes it so different from the other coronaviruses? We know there are coronaviruses floating around every year, and we don't see outbreaks and pandemics like this. So what's so different about this virus?
Well, so a couple of levels of answer. The first level is that the course of the disease is different. And as we discussed earlier, this one has a slow incubation period and is about as infectious as the flu, is my understanding. That combination is really bad. Now, that wouldn't be a problem if it just made us sick, but it's also got lethality certainly in elderly people, particularly high. So it's that lethality at the end after 10 to 14 days, and then the early lack of symptoms, especially in younger people who can even have barely anything. That's the bad combination. And if you compare that to SARS-1 and MERS, it was a much more severe disease, and you could isolate people more quickly. So that's the difference at the epidemiological and pathological level. At the biological level, molecular level, what's going on is that it's a pretty standard virus. It's an RNA virus-based virus, so it's a very ancient, it could be billions of years old, probably at least 500 million years old. RNA is the first genetic material. Why do I mention RNA? Because RNA is very difficult to maintain its information. When you copy RNA, any mutation established is actually locked in. Unlike our DNA, which has 2 strands, it can actually be repaired. So this thing is changing just like the flu, and it could change just like the flu to make things either better for us, it could wipe itself out, or it could be worse in a probably very small chance, 1% or less. But what makes it different really at the biological level is that it's extremely infectious. The spike protein, which I think most people will know, is the outer surface protein that engages with the ACE2 enzyme in our throats and nose. That one was modeled very quickly. Back in January, early February, scientists had shown that if you look at ACE2, it's like a cup, and the spike protein engages into that socket. Those contacts are really abundant. So amino acid contacts, it's more abundant contacts than, say, SARS or MERS, which were kind of on the side of the pocket. So this thing binds strongly. It's going to be hard to try and block that interaction with drugs, though there are some being tested. But that's the issue. It's not so much that it's binding and moving within our bodies. It's more that it's lethal, and that's what's caused this world pandemic issue.
David, you were mentioning some drugs that are potentially blocking the spike protein. What drugs are those, and are there other drugs that are currently in development?
Yeah. Also, somebody in the audience may know this, but I don't remember the names of the drugs. But I do recall that there were drugs that were being, at least in development, that were able to block the interaction. Now, of course, these were being developed with the intention of blocking SARS and MERS if it comes back out of camels where it's currently incubating. But I don't recall if they actually have any names given to them. I don't have any drug names off the top of my head. But there are a lot of drugs being developed. One of the things that gives me hope, despite all the bad news, is that at my last count, at least, there were 40 vaccine trials and over 55 drug trials worldwide of various sorts, including drugs that, if they work, could be very quickly prescribed by doctors. And we discussed earlier in this conference, I think it was just before most people had logged on, but we talked about hydroxychloroquine and others. So there's a lot going on. So, I mean, the one that's been, besides hydroxychloroquine, Plaquenil, getting a lot of attention, there's a couple of others that are worth talking about with you guys, and you should definitely chime in as MDs. Remdesivir, the trial started. This is Gilead's drug that's a pan drug against viral replication, the enzyme that replicates the RNA. Remdesivir has been in a trial since February 25th, I think it was. And my understanding is that we should hear some early results within the next couple of months. The good news with that is that it's known to be relatively safe, unlike a vaccine, which will have to be tested and tested and tested again until 18 months are up. One word on the vaccine, just I know I'm deviating. I saw Richard Dawkins' tweet last night that, why don't we just roll out the vaccine sooner? What about the safety? Why do we care so much about the safety? In this case, people are dying. Well, the answer to that is that there was a monkey trial with SARS-1 with the vaccines directed at the spike protein, the same tactic that's being used now for the vaccines for COVID-2. And those monkeys were actually sicker. And so you got to test this, because if you vaccinate 1 billion people with a vaccine that it even makes 5% of people sicker, you'd be vilified. So I don't think we can rush that one out. The other drug we should mention is Actemra. So the course of the disease for many elderly is an overreaction of the immune system. A low percent of people are actually dying specifically from what's called the cytokine storm. So two key cytokines are IL-1, interleukin-1, and I think more importantly, IL-6. And there are drugs that knock down IL-6 activity, either by an antibody directed at IL-6, which is a cytokine, or blocking the receptor's activity. And that's what Actemra does. And I'm not aware of a study that's proven Actemra is working 100%, but I know it's being used off-label, both in Britain and the US. But maybe you guys have more insights into how effective it's being.
One thing I would say about remdesivir, since you mentioned that, it seems to be very promising, but just to clarify for everyone listening, that is a IV medication that would be used in the hospital. So it's not something you could ask your doctor for necessarily. And then as far as vaccines go, a comment I wanted to make, just because it related to a question that already came through. There's so much suspicion around vaccines right now already. It is worrisome to think about rushing one out. Someone asked the question, if this becomes a mandatory vaccine, how can we avoid it? And we could tackle that question head on, but honestly, the bigger issue that brings up to me is how afraid people are of vaccines right now when it could be our biggest hope. So I don't think rushing one out that there are going to be even more safety concerns about is the right thing. So I would agree with you. Someone just popped the question up, and since we're on the topic, I'll ask it. What about herd immunity? Can you speak to herd immunity and when and how and if we would get there and what that means?
Yeah, so this pandemic only has one of two outcomes. One is that our populations develop herd immunity, and the other is we have a vaccine. That's it. That we cannot forever stay in our houses or not assemble. So what we're looking at is herd immunity forming over the next 18 months. Hopefully at a rate that the hospitals can deal with. There will still be fatalities in the elderly, no question. But what we're looking to have herd immunity, depending on how social we are, is somewhere between a third and 3/4 of us having recovered from this. And more likely it's about half of us will have caught it and recovered. And that would be enough for the virus to become at what we call the R0, R0, less than 1, which means it would decline down to 0, like the flu does every year.
So I was, in terms of vaccines, while we're on topic, when, this is a hard question, obviously, we're not asking you to predict the future, but in your best estimate, when do you think a vaccine is coming? And we know why it takes so long, as you already kind of spoke to testing and ensuring safety. But what's a reasonable guess for listeners as to when we might expect to see a vaccine?
Right. Well, so the government and Tony Fauci, who represents them, are saying what I believe to be true. So myself and Chris Mason, who I see is online coming up next, he and I are entrepreneurs. We know how long drugs take to make, and vaccines are longer than most. I started a vaccine company back in 2006. It's called Genosha. It's a public company now. I'm very aware of how hard vaccines are to test. And in fact, until recently, it wasn't a great business because they weren't very profitable. You know, you get one shot and that's it versus a chronic drug like a statin. So to answer your question, I think it is 18 months, certainly with all the US law. Now, there's one wild card. It could be that the studies that are being done in China, remember they had a 2 to 3 month head start on us. They may come out with something, and they can probably do clinical trials quicker than we can because of their regulations. So it could be the wild card that the Chinese government says, we've got a vaccine, here's the data, we've proven it's safe in our population at least. And then maybe the US government and governments around the world would allow those vaccines to be shipped globally. But I suspect that's a low chance. And it may even be that the US government says, we don't trust your data, we need to test it in our population first.
One question that we keep getting, David, every time we have you on the podcast or talk about you in any way is regarding NAD supplements and NMN and what role those may have or not have with regard to COVID-19 in terms of helping the immune system, or people just want to know, should I keep taking this stuff? Should I start taking it? And you're the best person to ask.
Oh, sure. Yeah, many people ask me that. They ask, does NAD boosting or resveratrol work against viruses? Well, the simple answer is there haven't been human studies, so we don't know. There have been a number of mouse studies in cell culture, but that's not enough to make medical decisions. And I don't think, at this point, you want to be taking the risk with a potentially lethal disease, especially if you're older with underlying diseases. Lives are at stake here, right? But let me tell you some of the data. I don't mind talking about scientific results. In cell culture, resveratrol does counteract numerous viruses, including MERS, and the first SARS, and including HIV, and that probably is what's thought to be due to the action of one particular enzyme in particular called SIRT1, which we have studied for years. And Melanie Ott, OTT, at the Gladstone has done a lot of work on this. But then again, you know, cell culture is one thing, human biology is very different. So I'm hesitant to make any conclusions at all on that. As for NAD, we've worked on NAD downplaying inflammation. We do have some data in mice on that. It's not very strong. Though, you know, there's a couple of anecdotes. Had a long conversation with a doctor in LA yesterday at Cedars Hospital where their patient was treated with NMN, which is an NAD boosting molecule, with no negative side effects and what was apparently a rapid recovery. But that's an N of one, and you know, you need N's of hundreds of people to conclude things usually. So then again, you know, in conclusion, we just don't know. If you want to know what I'm doing, you know, I'm secluded here on Cape Cod with my family. I'm not at risk of catching it that I'm aware of. So I continue to take my standard regimen until, you know, I go out into the world. And even then, I'm probably going to continue taking it.
Dr. Sinclair, can you talk to who is most susceptible and why? We had data talking about how the elderly were the most susceptible, but then there's new data coming out about other groups as well. Could you address who's most susceptible and why?
Right. Yeah, so the elderly are clearly going to be more susceptible. And I mean, some of the numbers are, you know, pretty grim for people with underlying diseases, such as, well, of course, COPD. Anything with the lung is dangerous. People without a spleen is an issue. Heart disease. So these are what we call comorbidities, diseases that come together. So there are a number of ideas. So one idea is that there's an overreaction of the immune system. And what we're seeing, or what's published, is that the younger people clear the disease and also are able to get over the course of the viral infection very quickly. And so you should ask Dr. Mason this as well, because I know he's on looking at this as well. He's analyzing the viral loads, as we call them, the CT scores. But what I've seen is that if you look at the viral loads, and I'll draw little graphs on the screen if you're watching, the people who have very quick courses and then, of course, decline are those that are going to be either asymptomatic or have very mild symptoms. And those people that the virus shoots up and then it stays high for many, many days are the ones that will go likely into the ICU and then possibly a ventilator. And then, so it's clear that the immune system, A, is not able to control the viral spread throughout the body and the numbers down. So that's part of it. So it's something to do with the immune system. But then there's a second issue in these late stage patients, which we talked about, the cytokine storm, which is where their immune system, even though the viral level is now coming down to, you know, and everyone is probably, you know, thinking this is all going to be okay. Not everyone, but relatives might think that. There's still a chance that that's when this storm kicks in. And that's governed largely by what's called the inflammasome and a particular protein complex called the NLRP3 complex. And that is governing their overreaction. And we know that elderly people have an overactive NLRP3. It goes up as you get older. And that's why Actemra is likely to be helpful there, because it's blocking the NLRP3 downstream effects. So that's one possibility, inflammasome. The other is, and I wrote about this, you could check it out, and I tweeted about it. So Professor Gordon, Gordan, Lauc, L-A-U-C, we wrote about the idea that we know that there are changes to the sugars, the carbohydrates that are added to proteins as we get older. And in particular, what's really important about that is the antibodies and even the ACE2 protein and the spike protein on the virus have different sugars attached, the older we get, the more different it is. And that controls undoubtedly how our immune system reacts during the course of the disease. And so we don't know yet, but Dr. Chris Mason and I have decided to collaborate on this, probably post-pandemic, to figure out in more detail what's going on, including at the level of the DNA clock. So many people know, and this is part 3 of my answer, we can measure the age of people biologically by measuring what's called their DNA methylation patterns on their genome. And that determines how old they are. It may be that older patients are just generally, all their cells have an older clock. Now, the clock isn't the biggest issue. What the problem is the clock indicates that those cells have lost their ability to be resilient and to turn on the right program of genes when needed. So again, that's about turning on the wrong genes at the wrong time. And that's probably what's causing a problem in the elderly. But of course, doctors will tell you that patients in general who have underlying diseases are just less resilient, and especially if they're in the lungs.
Yeah, Jody, if you don't mind, turn Dr. Mason on so he can comment if you'd like, since we've referred to him a few times. And David, one thing a statistic I just heard this morning that was reported, which was somewhat scary to me, was that in Colorado, 20% of the deaths have been in patients under 70, but in Georgia, 49% of the deaths so far have been under 70. So it speaks to the point you just made about any pre-existing condition, because it in general in the South in the United States, the health disparity between Georgia and Colorado, there is a difference there. There tends to be more obesity, more chronically ill patients. And so I really worry about some of the rural areas which haven't been hit as hard. It's going to affect, I think, some of the younger populations in those areas.
Yeah, and that's why I would encourage folks to stay on for Ben Greenfield's discussion, because he's going to talk about how to get in shape. And there's never been such an opportunity, if you're at home, or a reason to get into shape. And obesity is part of that, especially if you're type 2 diabetic. Now would be the time to lose some weight and eat well.
Thanks so much for listening to this COVID-19 update. Please send us your questions or follow along on Instagram and Facebook at WildHealthMD. And just to be clear, this is not medical advice. No patient-physician relationship has been established, and this resource is really for general informational purposes only. And finally, if you want to spread the word, please send this podcast to friends and family and give us a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and stay safe.